Studies Session 2: The Psychoanalytical Theory of Sigmund Freud. Introduction. The aim of this study session is to introduce you to the concept of human personality structure as propounded by Sigmund Freud. You will also learn how individuals come to cover up for their inadequacies by wanting to give reasons as to why they behave the way they do in certain situations. Finally, you will explore the postulation of Sigmund Freud on the stages of development. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, you should be able to describe how instincts affect human behavior, point out what constitutes the human personality, explain how personality is formed, and discuss the stages of personality development according to the psychoanalytic theory. Basic instincts of human behavior. Sigmund Freud, credited as the father of psychology, was the chief proponent of the psychoanalytic theory of personality development. According to him, people's behaviors are determined by irrational forces, unconscious motivations, biological and instinctual drives, and certain psychosexual events during the first 5 years of life. Instincts are a form of energy that connect the body's needs to the mind's wishes. When the body is in a state of need, the person experiences a condition of tension or pressure, and the person is motivated to relieve the pressure. Freud groups the instinct into two: life instinct and death instinct. The life instinct serves the purpose of survival of both the individual and the species by seeking to satisfy the needs for food, water, shelter, air, and sex. The death instinct accounts for aggressive drive, which compels us to destroy, conquer, and kill. Freud further explains the process of living as a continuous strife, conflict, an attempt to strike a balance between sex and the aggressive instinct without infringing on the society's rules and regulations, and without suffering personal shame and guilt. The structure of personality. As mental processes, Freud identifies three constructs of the mind, namely the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. The conscious is all about those things we are aware of in ourselves and the environment. He considers these to be a small and limited part of our personality because a small proportion of our thoughts, sensations, and memories exist in conscious awareness at any given time. The unconscious is the vaster area encompassing those events, wishes, desires, and impulses that have been repressed or censored from the unconscious mind. It contains the major driving power behind our behavior and is repository of forces we cannot see or control. Uber, 1987. Between these two mental processes of consciousness, above is a third one known as the preconscious. This is the storehouse of all memories, perceptions, thoughts, and the like, which we are not momentarily conscious of, but which we can bring to consciousness when we require them. If the memory passes scrutiny, it's allowed to pass into consciousness. If not, it is repressed into unconscious and must remain there. The above notion was, however, reviewed in 1923 by Freud, who then introduced three basic structures of personality, namely the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is present at birth and is the ultimate source of all psychic energy and that which is later utilized by the other components of personality. Its sole purpose is to obtain pleasure, and so it operates on the pleasure principle level. It is animalistic in nature and takes no precautions in expressing its processes, which are basically the survival of the individual and successful reproduction. The id is non-rational and amoral and does not experience any fear. Tension in the individual is reduced using either reflex action or primary process. Reflex actions involve the operation of an innate automatic reflex mechanism, such as blinking an eye or withdrawing a hand from a hot object. Primary process involves the formation of a mental image of some object known to satisfy a drive. A thirsty individual may form an image of cold bottle of Coca-Cola. The image is usually a hallucination. The id wants to be satisfied at all costs and would resist any obstruction on its part to get the pleasure gratified. Effective satisfaction of important drives requires some contact with the external reality and some degree of logical reasoning. Hence, the ego is considered as the seat of rational thoughts. It operates on the reality principle and mediates between the demand of the id, the reality of the world, and the demands of the superego. The ego delays gratification until there is an appropriate object in the external world to satisfy the need. For example, if you are hard pressed to urinate, you may form a mental image of a toilet to do it, but the ego would not allow the urine to come until you are able to sight a toilet or a convenient place to ease yourself. According to Uber 1987, the job of the ego, theoretically, is how to satisfy the id impulses within the limits of the society and without violating the rules of the superego. To minimize the guilt that may occur as a result of this conflict, the ego resorts to defensive processes. The superego is the third part of personality structure that is responsible for the internalized representation of the values and morals of the society as taught the child by the parents and others. This develops as the child inculcates social guidelines and structures. This learning process is a function of rewards and punishments by the parents for the behavior. Freud says that the superego is made up of two subsystems, namely the conscious and the ego ideal. The conscience represents things that the individual believes he or she should not do, while the ego ideal represents things that the individual would like to be. This controlling function of the superego occurs largely in the unconscious part of the mind, and so the individual may not be aware of this. For example, even if the place to ease yourself is available, the superego may urge that because you are a girl or lady and because many people are around, you should look for a more appropriate place to uphold your dignity. The superego represents what is ideal. In other words, the id seeks pleasure, the ego tests reality, and the superego strives for perfection. Brenner 1974 has summarized the function of the superego to be essentially that of our conscience, which approves or disapproves of our behavior or wishes, critically observes the self, administers self-punishment, demands repentance for wrongdoing, and rewards the self with self-praise and self-love. Defense mechanisms. In the last section, we observed that there is a constant conflict between the three parts of the personality structure, contesting for the realization of their individual functions. The conflict is referred to as intrapsychic conflict because the energy with which they pursue their different but dependent goals is derived from the libido within the individual. The biological id strives constantly and impulsively to satisfy its drives, but to do so, it must struggle with the reality and rationality of the ego and the morality of the superego. For example, consider the following. Hunger arouses tension in the id, which seeks immediate relief through the pleasure principle. The ego delays eating, that is, blocks its expression, until an appropriate food object is located. The superego may impose further delay by dictating certain requirements, certain calories needed, no fish on Friday, no stealing of food, and so on. In this instance, the individual becomes anxious. Anxiety is a state of uncomfortable tension that the person is motivated to reduce. Otherwise, it may lead to a neurotic disorder in the person. The ego tries to guard against this anxiety before it gets out of hand by any one of the mechanisms available to stop the anxiety-producing impulse in such a way as to reduce its threats or to block the expression of the impulse entirely. Repression. The most basic means by which the ego seeks to control the ill impulses is repression. This is by excluding or preventing from consciousness all painful or dangerous thoughts. For example, you can refuse to admit that a loved one is dead and say you believe he or she is sleeping, even when he or she is being lowered into the grave. The repressed idea or thought is not completely eliminated, but may find expression through other avenues, such as dreams and slips of tongue. Denial of reality. This is the process of protecting oneself from unpleasant reality by refusing to perceive it. For example, it is common among the born-again Christians that, rather than admit that they are feverish, they resort to saying that they are strong. They believe that if they say otherwise, they will not get out of the feverish situation. Another example is when you are pinched by your mother and you reply by saying that it doesn't pain you. To admit that it pains is to satisfy the pleasure of your mother for punishing you and you're feeling uncomfortable. Rationalization. This involves explaining unacceptable behavior in terms of some personally or socially acceptable motives, or in general, making excuses justifying unacceptable behaviors. For example, if a student failed in his term report, he would then blame the failure on the inability of the pen to write legibly, or that the teacher failed him or her because the student did not grade the teacher while coming into the class the previous week. Sublimation. This occurs when an individual expresses an unacceptable motive by substituting socially and personally acceptable behavior for the direct expression of the motive. For example, an individual may decide to join a judo club as a substitute for his or her aggressive tendencies. Displacement. This is when an individual discharges pent-up feelings, usually of hostility, on objects less dangerous or powerful than those which initially aroused the emotions. An example is when an elder brother hits his younger one after being scolded or beaten by his mother. Another example is when you are denied something by another person and you then see a dog lying down along the way, you may kick it repeatedly for no just cause. Reaction formation. This occurs when an individual attempts to prevent dangerous desires from being expressed by exaggerating opposed attitudes and types of behavior and using them as barriers. For example, a person who is threatened on the unconscious level by the allure and fascination of pornography may become an avid supporter of censorship. Compensation. Compensation is when an individual's shortcomings or inadequacies in particular are substituted with excessive involvement in another field or endeavor. For example, a person who had wanted to excel at sports but was lacking in athletic prowess might become a famous sport commentator. Identification. Here, one adopts the characteristics of an individual or institution perceived as being more powerful, successful, or otherwise desirable than oneself. It was common at the time among children to claim to be Mighty Eagle, a wrestler of note, and mimic his movements. Freud believed that a person's unique character type developed in childhood from the nature of the parent-child interaction. He conceived the development of each individual as dependent upon three principal sets of factors. 1. Innate instinctual forces. 2. Biologically determined developmental stages. And 3. Environmental influences. He observed further that a child is polymorphously perverse, that is, he or she derives pleasure from all parts of the body, but that this is usually concentrated in certain regions of the body with passage of time. Inability to properly resolve this pleasure at a particular stage would make the individual to be fixated, engrossed, and this would reflect in his or her behavior later in life. Freud believed that the adult personality is shaped and solidly crystallized by the 5th year of life. We shall now examine these stages. Psychosexual stages of development. The oral stage, from birth to 1 year. The baby's first contact with the world is through the mouth, which has great sensitivity. The stimulation of the baby comes through the mouth and lips, where an association between nursing and being fed constitutes the basis for oral stage of development. Sucking the mother's breasts satisfies the need for food and pleasure. There are two modes of activity during this stage, namely oral incooperative behavior and oral aggressive or sadistic behavior. The oral incooperative behavior occurs first, which involves pleasurable stimulation of the mouth. If fixation occurs, the individual engages in excessive eating, chewing, talking, smoking, kissing, drinking, and the like. At the infant teeth, the oral aggressive period begins. Biting is one prominent activity at this time. Adult characteristics as a result of obsessive interest include sarcasm, hostility, aggression, gossip, and degrading comments about others. At the oral stage, if the relationship between mother and child is too comfortable, the child will be excessively attached to his or her mother, and this will result in a dependent personality. The anal stage, 1 to 3 years. Beginning from the 2nd year through the 3rd year of life, the child enters into the anal stage, where the pleasure instinct is derived from the anal zone of the body. The pleasure is derived from the movement of the bowels, and how the child is toilet trained will go a long way in determining his or her personality. How the child withholds his or her bowel and empty it at the right place at the right time with the intervention of the parent would affect the personality formation. If strict toilet training methods are used, the child anger may be expressed through defecating at inappropriate places. If the child derives satisfaction from his behavior as means of expressing his or her frustration with the parent. Freud claimed that an anal aggressive personality is likely to form with sadistic and hostile traits. If too much attention is given to the child's bowel movement, the child may either develop creativity and productivity traits if praises are given at the appropriate time, or an obsessive personality with concern of personal hygiene and neatness, or stinginess, which Freud called anal retentive personality. The phallic stage, 3 to 5 years. At about age 4, the child's focus of libidinal gratification is shifted to the genital area. Hence, the stage of phallic, phallus for penis, is entered into. One sign of increased genital pleasure is that children of both sexes fantasize and masturbate about this age, and the major event of this stage is what is called the Oedipus conflict or complex. The conflict derives from the unconscious incestuous desires that children develop towards the parent of the opposite sex. There is a triangle form of relationship. At one end is the child, at the other end is the love object, and yet at another end is the parent of opposite sex. There is a feeling of threat because of limitation placed by the society. Yet, the child must find expression for his or her feelings, and this develops into anxiety, castration anxiety. To be more specific, the boy initially adopts the mother as a love object and behaves seductively towards her. At the same time, he recognizes the father as a rival for the mother's affection and comes to fear that his father will punish him by cutting off his penis. Smith and Vetter, 1982. Through identification, the boy begins to take on some of his father's behaviors and values in the hope that the father would be displaced and he would take over. On the other hand, the girl develops what is called the Electra complex, which is more or less a desire to have penis envy, blaming her mother for the lack of penis, and so becomes hostile towards her, but develops an attraction toward the father who has the desired organ. The latest stage, 5 to 12 years. The oral, anal, and phallic periods taken together are known as the pregenital period. A major characteristic of this period is a narcissistic orientation, or an inward and self-centered preoccupation. During this latency period, new interests replace infantile sexual impulses. Freud believed that after the phallic stage, there is a sort of resting period before the next major change in the child's sexual development. Then too, the child starts schooling activities during this period. The sexual drive is sublimated to some extent into activities in school, hobbies, sports, and friendships with members of the same sex. There is a turning outward towards relationships with others and learning to adjust to an ever-widening world. This period prevails until the onset of puberty. The genital stage, 12 to 18 and older. The further changes of hormones and the genital organs that take place during puberty reawaken the sexual energy of the child. Adolescents typically develop interest in the opposite sex, engage in some sexual experimentation, and begin to assume adult responsibilities. Freud placed some emphasis on the fact that not everyone walks through this period to a point of mature heterosexual love if there have been no major fixations at any of the earlier stages of development. There are still many societal sanctions and taboos concerning sexual expression to which the adolescent must conform. Conflict is minimized through the use of sublimation. At this stage, as adolescents move out of the adolescence and into mature adulthood, they develop intimate relationships, become free of parental influence, and develop the capacity to be interested in others. There is a trend away from narcissism and towards altruistic behavior and concern for others. Accordingly, working and loving as well as deriving satisfaction from them are of paramount importance. As we can see, Freud strongly emphasized the importance of the early years of childhood in determining the adult personality. Each of these stages is fraught with the potential for producing frustrations, conflict, and threats. Freud believed that individuals deal with these tensions through identification, displacement, and other defense mechanisms. Psychoanalytic assessment techniques. Generally speaking, psychoanalytic approach to personality assessment is geared towards increasing awareness, gaining intellectual insight into the patient's behavior, and understanding the meanings of symptoms. To understand the personality of his patients, Freud primarily employed the case study method, through which he was able to carry out detailed and exhaustive analysis of their lives and past experiences. With this bit of information, he was able to help them overcome their problems. Though Freud explored different methods of personality assessment, the following came to be major psychoanalytic techniques for assessment: free association, dream analysis, and transference. Free association. As one of Freud's techniques, free association demands that the patient will report whatever thought or memory that occurs to him without any kind of self-censorship. The analyst instructs the patient to relax with his eyes closed, while clearing his mind of day-to-day thoughts and preoccupations, and as much as possible to say whatever comes to his mind, regardless of how painful, silly, trivial, or irrelevant it may be. The therapist stays off the side of the patient so as not to influence his thoughts and reactions. This technique often leads to some recollection of past experiences and at times a releasing of intense feelings that might have been blocked off. To help the patient, the analyst identifies the repressed thoughts that are locked in the unconscious of the patient. One key thing is that the analyst listens to the patient, prods occasionally by asking relevant questions when the verbal flow of the patient dries up, but does not interrupt when the patient is talking. Everything the patient says is related without exception to what has previously been said. There may be numerous verbal blockades, but eventually the history of the person's mind and its present organization will be divulged to the listener analyst by following the chain of association through the verbal maze. Dream analysis. With dream analysis, patients are asked to relate their dreams, while the analysts interpret the symbols present in the manifest content of their dreams in an attempt to discover the latent or hidden meanings. Freud found that dreams often reveal important repressed memories. In other words, during sleep, defenses are lowered and repressed feelings surface. Freud saw dreams as a way to the unconscious, where one's unconscious wishes, needs, and fears are expressed. In dream analysis, two aspects of the content of the dream are of great importance. The manifest content, which is the actual event that takes place in the dream, and the latent content, which is the hidden meaning of the event seen in the dream. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed defense mechanisms and why people resort to them. Following, we identified are the types of defense mechanisms: repression, denial of reality, rationalization, sublimation, displacement, reaction formation, compensation, and identification. We also discussed Freud's psychosexual analysis of human development. The stages of psychosexual stages of development discussed were anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. Various assessment techniques in psychoanalytic theory were explained. There are two kinds of instincts which govern the way man behaves. They are the life instinct and the death instinct. He went on to explain human mental processes as constituting the conscious, the unconscious, and the preconscious. However, he later reviewed the basic structures of personality as the id, the ego, and the superego. The id seeks pleasure, the ego tests reality, and the superego strives for perfection. End of study session 2. Thank you for listening.